Hi, welcome back. Well, if there's one part of the Bible that has caused more confusion and consternation and speculation than any other, it would have to be the final book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. But fortunately, here with us today we have Dr. Cale Duval, who's a New Testament scholar and has just written this great book on Revelation, Ancient Words, Present Hope. So, Cale, why Revelation? What's so special about Revelation? Why should a Christian read it? Because it's been seen as a closed book for a long time, hasn't it?
That's very true, Kent. Look, I'm delighted to be here. In fact, the opening sentence, the revelation of Jesus Christ, tells us that revelation in the original Greek is actually a disclosure or an unveiling. Mm-hmm. So the book, while rich in symbolism and metaphor, is honestly a revelation, a disclosure and an unveiling of Jesus Christ. Mm. And the challenge for the ordinary reader is to work through the symbols and the metaphors and the complexity of language to discover Jesus. But certainly, Kent, Jesus is at the heart and center of the book of Revelation.
Wow, okay. Now, I notice you've subtitled this book, What the Old Testament Teaches Us About Revelation. But if I'm not wrong, Revelation doesn't have one single direct quote from the Old Testament in its whole, 22 chapters. So how did you manage to write a whole book on something that's, some people would say, is not even there?
That's a very good question, Kent. In fact, of the 404 verses in the book of Revelation, 278 of those verses have allusions or perhaps even echoes to the Old Testament.
Okay, so not direct quotes.
That's correct.
But allusions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So there's a rich density of Old Testament ideas, symbols, persons, events within the book of Revelation. We need to remember that for John, his Bible was the Old Testament.
Sure.
And guided by the Spirit of God, having spent time with Jesus in person in his ministry, and looking at Jesus in terms of the way in which he modeled and taught and exemplified the Old Testament scriptures, no doubt that had a major impact on John and his understanding. And so when he received his visions of Jesus on Patmos, the language he used is the language of his own past, the language of his own scriptures. And so he found a rich, beautiful resource in the Old Testament scriptures to convey the beauty of what he had found now in Jesus Christ.
Okay. And so I guess it's really important to understand Revelation written in its own historical context to its own first audience. And that was the 7 churches of Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
What did Revelation mean to them, do you think?
Meaning must begin for us in that first century context. It made sense to those early Christians in the 7 churches of Asia Minor. And there again, their scriptures were the Old Testament. So while we might struggle to understand some of the allusion and echo, for those early Christians, they understood it immediately when they heard the symbols and the allusions pointing to those Old Testament scriptures. In that first century context, the dominant socio-political power of the world back then was the Roman Empire.
Of course, right, yeah.
And so there's no question that for that first century audience, the powers of Revelation 13, the religious and political forces in Revelation 13, would have pointed them to the Roman Empire.
And John, of course, is imprisoned by the Roman Empire on Patmos, so Rome would have been looming very large in his experience.
Most definitely, most definitely. But beyond that, you know, the book of Revelation states quite clearly that John was in the Spirit when he received these visions. So it's a rich, charismatic text. And so the Spirit of God has inspired John. So not only do we work at the level of what is John desiring to communicate to the early Christians in first century Asia Minor, but what is the Spirit of God saying through John to us, even as contemporary readers? And it's at that point, Kent, that we realize that the symbols, the metaphors, don't just point to what's happening in that first century context, but because it's an inspired text coming to us from God, it has meaning for us even in our present context as well.
Okay. Now, I was at your recent book launch where you launched this book, Ancient Words, Present Hope. And one of the theologians who was there sort of commenting on your book, she said, you know, I was always interested in mathematics as a child, and so I really enjoyed Revelation because it it involved puzzles and symbols and things that needed to be decoded. But you've actually said, in some ways, Revelation is not so much a puzzle than a poem. What do you mean by that? And what are maybe the dangers of reading it as a puzzle rather than a poem?
Yeah. Kent, we've got to be so careful when we study the symbols in Revelation. You know, when we study Scripture, the simple approach is we've always got to take it from a literal standpoint. With Revelation, the basic standpoint is we've always got to interpret from a symbolic standpoint, you know. So it's a very different approach to all the other books within the New Testament and indeed the Old Testament as well. I think we've got to be cautious not to look for a one-to-one correspondence between a symbol and something in our contemporary society, Russia or China or America. I think we do the book a great disservice when we attempt to look at the symbols and make a correspondence or an application to our present context without first looking at the book and its message in its historical context, number one, number two, in its Old Testament context, and then within the larger context of Scripture itself in terms of what is God saying to us as human beings, and then have a look at how does this apply to our present day context.
In saying that, though, Kyle, are you departing, because you're the head of the Adventist seminary here in Australia, the Avondale Seminary, and the traditional Adventist understanding, as far as I understand it, is that some of these powers and beasts mentioned in Revelation have very specific one-to-one correspondence. You know, the beast that comes out of the sea is the apostate church. The beast that comes out of the land is the United States of America. I mean, we've been that specific about it. Are you departing from that orthodoxy in suggesting that?
By no means, by no means. What I mean by this, Kent, is that we need to look at, firstly, the applicability of the symbol in its first century context.
Sure.
And say that meaning making begins there, and the text is speaking to that audience. But beyond that, the text is also speaking to us. Our pioneers were brave and indeed courageous in identifying the land beast of Revelation 13:11 as the United States, because at
their
that
own
stage,
country, yeah.
Exactly. But beyond that, at that stage, the United States was not a dominant world player. And so for them to make that interpretation in the 1800s already was, as I say, was brave and courageous. And I believe as we look at the landscape of politics and society today, we clearly see that the dominant force being the United States around the world. What I've tried to do, Kent, is to move away from sensationalism, to move away from headlines, to move away from trying to constantly apply the text to our present day. I think we rob the book of its richness by discounting its rich spiritual and theological and practical application to our own hearts and our own lives. So I'm an Orthodox Adventist Christian as far as that goes, but I think we need to look at the book in its richness, and in rather pointing to beasts and political powers and forces that might come onto the world scene down the track, the book really encourages the reader to focus on Jesus Christ and to focus on how the message of the book impacts their own personal walk with Jesus. Wow.
Hey, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it, Cale. If you'd like to get hold of Ancient Words Present Hope, you can do that. It's on Amazon. You can get a Kindle version as well, I understand.
That's correct.
That's right. You can also check out the Adventist book centres in Australia and New Zealand, and perhaps going to other Christian bookstores pretty soon. Thanks so much for your time, Cale. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kent.
We'll be back straight after the break.